Hello, everyone. We might just start if that's all right with everyone. First of all, my name is Margarita. I'm from Women with Disabilities Australia. I'm a white woman. I have brown hair, lipstick on, and a pink striped shirt. Thank you all for coming. Very exciting to see all of you. So just a quick bit of housekeeping. First of all, I want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of the Lenape people. And I also want to acknowledge that we're, especially from Australia, and any of you who are in Australia or came from Australia are traveling from unceded lands there. I'm traveling from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people in Perth. And I want to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, as well as acknowledge that Indigenous women around the world have really put in a lot of work for feminist movements and specifically disability movements. I also want to acknowledge Lori over here, who is doing our sign language interpreting. We are going to try speak slowly so that we're not rushing, but we just want to thank her. And also, there's going to be some videos playing up on the screen. We have 2 videos. They will have captions, and yeah, just letting you know that those will be happening. We also have a Q&A section at the end, so please feel free to, if you have any notes, if you have any questions, yeah, keep them for the end and we'll have some time there. Or you can also catch any of us after the session, I'm sure. So a little bit about Women with Disabilities Australia is that we're one of the peak disability organisations in Australia, and we're also a women's alliance, which is essentially a peak governmental organisation that represents women. We're one of the very few organisations that represent women with disabilities, one of the few that are attending CSW alongside with Women Enabled International and a few others. And also one of the few organisations of people with disabilities attending from Australia, which there was just a Pacific session in here earlier, and we want to acknowledge that not only is it far for us as disabled women, but also it's really important representation at such a large event like CSW. And so again, we thank you all for coming to this session, but also I guess, yeah, it's really important for us to be here. And this year is no different considering the larger attendance at the conference. As well as that, we are really here to talk about sexual and reproductive rights and technology. And I want to acknowledge that this morning there was a session on sexual and reproductive rights and technology, and that it's a topic that I haven't seen as much of at CSW, but one that is incredibly important. And one that we will be continuing to advocate for post CSW forever, et cetera, et cetera. So really quickly, I will be introducing the other panel members just before they speak, but I do want to quickly just mention that we have Kelly next to me and Anastasia at the end of the table, both of whom are amazing advocates and who you'll hear from a little bit later. Quickly, before we start, I was thinking that we are going to do a little bit of introduction to ableism watching this video. It is by the UN, so it's relevant to our work. And then Kelly is going to give us a little bit of a further deep dive into the topic. As well as that, quickly, I want to acknowledge that a longtime American disability advocate, Judy Heumann, passed away a couple of days ago. And I want to acknowledge the hard work that she has done in America, but also that's impacted us around the world. And
I've actually got a short quote by Judy that I thought was probably would speak to everybody in the room, but she said it as a disabled woman. And it's quite short. So some people say what I did changed the world, but really I simply refused to accept what I was told about who I could be. And I was willing to make a fuss about that. And I think for everybody at CSW, that's why we're here, to make a fuss. So I think that that's a really pertinent quote from Judy today.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to play this video and then I'll pass over to Kelly, hoping that all works out. hold on, sorry.
What is ableism? It is a form of discrimination based on a value system that considers certain body and mind characteristics essential to living a fulfilling life and assumes that the quality of life of people with disabilities must be very low. In ableism, like in racism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression, dominant social groups project their own image as the model for how humanity should be, rejecting or ignoring others as inferior, not normal, or unfit. This bias is used to justify their exclusion, sometimes even their extermination. One example is the eugenics movement, which emerged in the early 20th century and resulted in the forced sterilization of more than 60,000 women, men, and children with disabilities under the pretext of improving humanity's gene pool. In Nazi Germany, more than 300,000 persons with disabilities were exterminated because their lives were considered unworthy. But despite the scale of these atrocities, ableism continues to spread, and its significance remains little understood. Ableist social views still shape our understanding of what it means to live with disabilities and how the lives of people with disabilities are valued. Thousands of women and girls continue to be sterilized against their will, and many more persons with disabilities spend their lives confined in institutions, prisons, or at home, and deemed to be incapable of living in the community. Ableism underpins the way our societies are organized. Basic daily activities, such as going to school or work, taking public transport, doing groceries, or practicing a hobby are made difficult, if not impossible, for persons with disabilities and end up excluded and isolated. Human rights challenge ableism and other forms of oppression and fight for a world where diversity is valued and embraced. Humanity is always changing. People everywhere use their minds and bodies in different ways, and those differences are what makes us stronger. Human diversity is all around us. We are all part of it. Let's embrace it.
All right, not very loud there, so apologies, but also and a little bit inspirational at the end. But I might just quickly pass to Kelly to give us a little bit more of some insight there.
Yeah, I think, so I've got a quote by a person called T.L. Lewis, and I think it goes to when the video. Yeah. So it goes to, I think in the video when they said that ableism underpins the way society organises. So T.L. Lewis states that you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism, although it's most common for disabled people. Ableism is central to settler, colonial and racist privileging of wide access to property, resources and legal protections, and to neoliberalism, which imposes responsibility on individuals for their own economic well-being and physical survival, while simultaneously maximising profit from the bodies of those least able to meet this ideal. This is because the concepts of abnormalcy, unproductivity, incapacity, and unfitness, which mediate the status and treatment of people with disability, also mediate oppression of other marginalised individuals and groups, such as those who are Indigenous, poor, and racialised. Historically, this mediation might be understood as a eugenics logic, which groups together as biologically deficient and dangerous a variety of marginalised groups, such as those who are poor, racialised, Indigenous, have drug addictions, STIs, are LGBTI, or who are sex workers. Specific historical examples include the White Australian policy, which applied to racialised non-white migrants and people with disability, and the protectionist policies of the Stolen Generation era that justified removal of First Nations children on the basis of racist and colonial presumptions about the intellectual and mental capacity of parents. The weaponisation of these concepts against other marginalised individuals and groups endure in a contemporary context. And that goes on, but I think that gives everybody a bit of an idea that ableism is something disproportionately that impacts disabled people, but it's not just a thing that impacts disabled people. And I think that's important when we're looking across broader topics around reproductive rights and sexual rights and stuff like that. Yeah, thank you for holding my microphone.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Kelly. And actually, we're going to hear from Kelly again next, but I will give Kelly a little bit of an introduction. And that is, Kelly works with other disabled people to affect change around disability and human rights issues. This has included better provision of services within the NDIS, which is the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia, lobbying for a royal commission, and a wide range of other local, national, and international issues, as well as being someone that I really admire. As a disabled woman, Kelly has firsthand understanding and lived experiences of issues affecting disabled people. She's been actively involved in representing the rights of disabled people, both nationally and internationally, and is a contributing member of the disability rights movement in Australia. I would say more than contributing. She's passionate about working to uphold the rights of all disabled people to ensure they're able to live the life they want. She has specific interests in natural disaster recovery, which she spoke about at the UN last year, violence prevention, intersectionality issues, and the way that these further marginalize and disadvantage people with disability. She believes that we should make sure all disabled people have a voice, especially people who come from exceptionally marginalized backgrounds. So Kelly, I might pass to you to talk a little bit about sexual and reproductive rights and really what technology, what role technology plays in enhancing sexual and reproductive rights and also needs and wants of people with disability around the world.
I think it's all right. I think I'd like to start by acknowledging, technology being the theme for this year. And a lot of the conversation is around, technology in terms of online spaces and, cyber-based stuff. But for disabled people, technology and disabled women is much broader. Technology is everything for us. It's my wheelchair. It is the internet and the way that we use that to connect and build community and provide peer support. I think I certainly wouldn't be here if it wasn't for connecting with other disabled women in online spaces and then building friendships and, learning about that we have peak bodies and we have systemic advocacy organisations to then go on to become, a part of those organisations to then, representing in places like this. That's Facebook. It was Facebook that started that process and just happening upon a couple of people. So yeah, technology for us is everything, and it's all part of our everyday. And then we use it for with some of us, reproductive stuff, IVF, and where that's needed, and acknowledging again that the medical ableism is a thing, and we'll hear in one of the videos of one person's journey with medical ableism in accessing that type of technology. And I wanted to touch on just advances in technology in general that benefit everybody, but particularly disabled people. We talk all the time about, universal access benefiting everybody, and it certainly benefits disabled people in lots of ways. And then I think when we look at recent events, things like COVID and what happened in lockdowns and some of the things that, the Australian government was quite quickly able to put in place, like work from home and all of that technology, and suddenly you can access telehealth. They're things that disabled people have been asking for decades in some cases, that, it was too hard, it couldn't be done. And then suddenly when it impacted on everybody else overnight, we can do it. We've got telehealth, we've got working from home. So that was quite an interesting and upsetting sometimes process to watch. Like, it was great that we could finally access it, but yeah, I think the circumstances were a little hard to watch. And then I think just to end my little rant, just acknowledging that the ways that I guess technology benefits, or disadvantages in whichever way it goes, that it's not the case for everybody in our community. And particularly want to acknowledge, First Nations people from non-English speaking backgrounds, and migrant people who, rural and remote, who don't have the same access to all the technologies that we do all the time.
This is getting fiddly. Thank you, Kelly. We do have a little video afterwards about some of those things that Kelly was speaking about. And I might just add some comments on that. And really, what's really interesting is I've noticed at the conference, we've talked a lot about the future of technology, about AI, about getting girls in STEM, about what's happening next. But we're not really talking about what's happening now and what investments we need to do now to make sure that things are accessible and inclusive of the sexual and reproductive rights of women and girls. Something that I've heard a lot being brought up is how digital tools and resources have been able to enable and empower women and girls to get out of domestic violence situations, to find out their reproductive rights, to get access to treatments like IVF and things like that. But we're not talking about how the majority of these things, from apps to services to trying to get inside a doctor's lobby, are not accessible. They're not inclusive, they're not easy to use, they might not be in easy English, they might not be, even a web page that's too hard to navigate is not accessible. And so I think that the conversation really needs to shift from just talking about what is the future looking like and praising a lot of these tools that have been so useful for so many women, but not for us in many situations. And that includes the fact that as young people and as young women, I definitely think about how my family did not accept the word disability when I first got diagnosed. It was not something we talked about. I should not have identified with the word disability. It was a very dirty word because I wasn't going to get a job and I wasn't going to, be able to do anything except stay in my room shut and, I don't know, lie there in the dark. And so then slowly talking to my parents, my family, about online resources, about what does language mean, sending them information, has been able to address that cultural stigma. And we can see that technology, when it is accessible, is so useful for women with disabilities of all different backgrounds. But unfortunately, it's just not where it needs to be in accessibility. It's not where it needs to be in accessibility, in affordability, and also in, I guess, being widespread as a thing. As well as that.
Can I just add?
Go for it.
When we're talking about sexual and reproductive rights and technology, and linking back to eugenics, as it was mentioned in the ableism video, that technology sometimes is used against us as well in terms of sexual and reproductive rights in prenatal screening and the pressure. Women absolutely have a right to choose with their body, but there is an incredible amount of pressure placed on women to do all of that prenatal screening and then make particular decisions based on that. And again, we'll hear more about in one of the videos. But yeah, I wanted to point out that technology is not always in our best interest or in our community's best interest.
Yes, exactly. And we've talked a lot about barriers, and we do talk a lot about barriers, but I do think there's a particular conversation to be had about, well, how do we move forward and how do we address these things? And we talk a lot about it in the disability community, and I'm sure Anastasia will also talk a little bit about this. And that is not only financial investment and co-design and putting people with disabilities first and foremost, including them, but also we need legal frameworks to support ourselves. We need advocates and feminists and people around the world to be allies with us. As I mentioned earlier, we are one of the few disability organizations at CSW, one of the few disability events. The list goes on. And unfortunately, if we don't have the support of feminists and women more globally and more largely, we just won't be able to be included in the conversation. Unfortunately, it comes back to the fact that often people who are discriminated against hold the responsibility for their own rights and to advocate for themselves. And although we do that every day, just because our own existence is often questioned, without the support of larger movements and without the support of larger organizations, we will never be able to get where we need to be. And so I sort of want to end, before I passed over to Anastasia, on this morning there was another side event on sexual and reproductive rights. And Samia Habil, who talks from a youth perspective, but also an app and podcast and tools perspective, mentioned that communities are finding it difficult to care about technology when we don't have access to basic human rights and needs. She mentioned that if a community is lacking food or shelter or care or access to hospitals or medication and basic human things that they need, it's so difficult for those communities to care about technology and care about AI or what the future is looking like, because their basic needs haven't been met. And I think that that rings so true for us when we're having difficulty accessing basic sexual and reproductive rights that women in many places have been able to access, when we're having to go through multiple hoops to access things as basic like the pill, then we really aren't concerned with what's happening in the big space of technology and what's happening in new developments and who's creating new things, because we don't have those basic foundations yet. So that's a little bit from me, but I will pass over to Anastasia as well, and then I'll play a video. So Anastasia is the Senior Legal Advisor at Women Enabled International, another really important disability women's rights organization here at CSW. And she conducts research, drafts publications, and implements inclusive programming projects addressing the intersection of disability rights and gender rights and inclusive service provision. She was the primary author of the UNFPA and Women Enabled International publication, Women and Young People with Disabilities, Guidelines for Providing Rights-Based and Gender-Responsive Services to Address Gender-Based Violence and Sexual and Reproductive Health Rights. Since its publication, she's been involved globally in implementation of these projects focused on disability inclusion. She's conducted workshops for over 370 stakeholders and has really led some important assessment research on inclusive services. Prior to joining Women Enabled International, she was a staff attorney in the protection and advocacy for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities program at Disability Rights New York. And she also graduated from the Cardozo School of Law in 2014 and has really achieved a lot of achievements since then. So thank you, Anastasia, for being with us, and take the floor.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and so much to Women with Disabilities Australia for inviting Women Enabled International to be here. We are huge admirers of your work, and so it's really an honor to be invited to join this panel with you. As was said, Women Enabled International is an international non-governmental organization that advocates at the intersection of gender and disability to ensure that women and gender diverse people with disabilities can live self-determined lives. And we do that particularly in the realm of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So one of the things I'm hoping to highlight in my time here today is some of the good practices that we've implemented, particularly with gender actors who, when we first worked with them, were skeptical about how to implement disability inclusion and frankly didn't feel that responsibility to understand what it meant to make a space inclusive for people with disabilities. That was the case before the pandemic, but then the pandemic really emphasized the need that also extends to digital spaces and the spaces that people have been inhabiting for the last 34 years, and how that has to be done and how it's very much doable. And so the digital world, as Kelly said, has always been a rich space for people with disabilities. There are already a wealth of good practices, important communities that exist. And so learning, as is the case in any space that involves disability inclusion, learning from the experts with disabilities themselves in the community on how that space is already being made accessible, what is needed to make that space accessible is just the key fundamental takeaway that if I can tell you nothing, that is the main thing I hope you take from this. And so what I hope to do today is share those good practices with you. But as just some introductory points, people with disabilities have always lived those rich lives online. As Kelly was describing, it touches every part of life. Pre-Elon Musk, Twitter was certainly a good example of the dialogue and the important kind of developments in our advocacy space and the conversations that were being had cross countries, cross identities, cross communities. And before that, Facebook, the blogosphere, that's where you can really see. So this isn't a new area for the disability community by any means. But as with physical spaces, technology has not advanced in many ways to make those spaces accessible, and people don't take responsibility for even utilizing the technology that has been developed to make those spaces accessible. And that extends to diversity of disability. We have in our community a huge range of disabilities, and so oftentimes we always need to check ourselves in the disability community to make sure we are being flexible, that we're checking into making sure the spaces are diverse in their accessibility and confronting head on when some of those accessibilities are in tension with one another, and how can we resolve them to make sure that we are still creating that inclusive dialogue in an online space. So as Kelly was saying, one positive thing to come out of this reliance on a digital space from the pandemic, as disheartening as it has been to see how so many things that were impossible before are suddenly possible, which requires us to really stand up as we go back to saying, well, actually in person is good, that we make sure that those advances don't get pulled back in any way. But we've seen, particularly in the advocacy space, that there has been more reliance, more recognition that we can utilize that in digital space for effective advocacy. But that requires investment through money, capacity strengthening of both institutions and individuals to understand how to make those spaces accessible, and really a development of a cohort of good practices that we can all learn from. So some examples from WEI's work. The research that was done by WEI and my co-workers who led it are here on the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on women and gender diverse people with disabilities really showed how you can do really comprehensive and deep, meaningful research that documents the impact of human rights abuses in the digital space. So they were able to conduct 20 virtual consultations with people with diverse disabilities and implement a survey of 173 people with disabilities from Latin America to Asia Pacific to Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and Central Asia that really demonstrated this impact, all from our remote locations. And there was no, historically, a lot of that documentation research would, particularly from a global North advocacy perspective, there was an expectation that you needed to go from the global North, you needed to go to the global South, and you could only be the people who could physically get themselves to a space to do that documentation research, or that you had the limitation to go to their spaces. So through that research, we were able to demonstrate that even with diverse disabilities, diverse identities, that you really can do that rich, diverse documentation as well. We also, over the pandemic period, have been conducting needs assessment research on access to sexual and reproductive health and rights services and gender-based violence services in the Pacific, particularly Fiji, Samoa, and Vanuatu. And the original model for that work, which is being done with the UNFPA, the UN Reproductive Health Agency, was that old model of, us as some global North-based researchers would go to the Pacific, we would do that research. And the pandemic gave us the opportunity to say, there's no need. There are brilliant researchers with disabilities in those countries who could do just as important research. And we were able to demonstrate that by working closely with the organizations of persons with disabilities and the networks in the Pacific they conducted an in-person focus group, which that was the modality they felt was best for their communities, particularly to do the outreach of the rural communities. And they were able to transmit that, and we worked together, which really, I think, did a lot for deepening the relationship between the UN agencies in the Pacific and organizations of persons with disabilities. So through that, they interviewed over 120 people with disabilities. We conducted online consultations with ministries and organizations of people with disabilities. We conducted online surveys that we were told by the organizations of persons with disabilities was really the mechanism that was most effective to them, because it was most helpful for them to manage their time and be able to provide those answers in their own timeline, including in the rural areas in the Pacific that previously, if we had come to a UN agency and said, we're going to do a Google Forms for the outreaching islands in Fiji, they probably would have said, that's a terrible idea. But instead, we were really able to get really rich insight, being led, of course, by the organizations of persons with disabilities in the community. And then I'm going to give a few more good practice examples from this, but of course, there's the work that we've been doing, the Gender Equality Forum and the Inclusive Generation Equality Collective, and their publication of Feminist Accessibility Protocol, which includes a whole section on accessibility in virtual spaces, and really came out of the fact that the GEF process and the virtual spaces that will be inhabited and supposed to be accessible to people with all different identities were completely inaccessible to people with disabilities. And so the Feminist Accessibility Protocol really seeks to address that problem and summarize those good practices. So I'll end with some of those examples from that document, but encourage you to take a look and utilize that document. And then next is, as Kelly was saying, the online space is a huge, important area for community building for our community and connecting people who, might not have the opportunity to have that confidence to, as Margarita was saying, to have that, especially if there's a diagnosis that comes later on, to have that chance to work with other people and talk to people with other disabilities. So one space we've seen that communities really thrive is through the alliances that we work with. So we have the US Alliance of Women, Non-Binary Persons, and Other Gender Minorities here in the US. And we also coordinate the collective of Latin American Women for Human Rights. And because of the pandemic, neither of those alliances have ever met in person. And yet they have done important advocacy and really developed a real sense of community and sharing in the online spaces that they inhabit on Zoom and in WhatsApp groups. And lastly, just to point out that another area that we've really found that that previously virtual seemed like a silly idea is that we've been working with UNFPA to develop a curriculum for people with disabilities on sexual reproductive health and rights and gender-based violence to provide that kind of basic information to support further advocacy. And previously, the idea of you doing that in a virtual space, we've heard again and again, well, these are too sensitive subjects. You can't talk about these, especially the people with disabilities in the digital space. And of course, it requires that flexibility and knowing your community to be able to identify what is the best space. Is it in person or is it virtual? But through the pilots that we've done of that curriculum in China and Botswana and talking to the people who have taken it, there is a lot of value, and we've really proven wrong the belief that you can't have these dialogues and this rich learning for people with disabilities, all disabilities within this virtual space. It just requires a commitment to accessibility, especially when there's different accessibility needs in a digital space. So that will be published later this year. So just to end on some of the key good practices that the Feminist Accessibility Protocol highlights. So one is to hold online meetings and events in low bandwidth platforms and where possible offer participants stipend to cover internet expenses. Conduct accessibility audits in virtual spaces like you should be doing in physical spaces. Recognize that digital divide that Kelly talked about, and make sure that you're addressing it head on by offering stipends, offering flexibility of maybe, in Botswana, we had some people, the internet wasn't fast enough for sign language interpreters. So one of the participants went to the UNFPA offices. We had a hybrid event like that to make it accessible. And when using uncommon platforms, make sure you offer pre-technology events where people have that ability to practice with their screen reader technology, to practice with the types of engagements you're doing, whether it be a breakout room, and really practice that and get comfortable with it before they are in that space themselves. And just to end on, that idea, we need to be looking at the holistic picture of the digital space, recognizing that digital space isn't always safe for anyone, including people with disabilities. So ensuring that we prioritize digital safety for people with disabilities as well. And the FPAR Academy on Digital Rights and Security briefing, I haven't done it myself, but it seems like a fantastic resource. And then you have resources for people with particular types of disabilities, like the Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, my technology handbook, and the Inclusion International and Down Syndrome International's Listening with Respect guidelines, which both document how to make spaces inclusive for people with intellectual disabilities who might not have been introduced to those spaces in a safe and empowering way. So thank you so much for letting me speak and being part of this panel.
Yeah.
Just following on that, for you guys to go and have a look if you want. One of the examples, so when we talk about Twitter and the disability community organizing and supporting each other, if you have a look at #disability Twitter, you will see the way that we organize and support. And yeah, it's endless and amazing sometimes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anastasia, and Kelly as well. It's really important to have some of those set guidelines already done and resources. And it's really amazing to hear some of the work you've done, especially my favorite, I guess, highlight is considering that we don't always have to go to places like the Pacific to do good research, and that there's people with skills and those particular skills all over the world that we can really engage with. So we've talked a little bit about services and guidelines and things like that to do with sexual and reproductive rights, and considering how much we connect with each other around the world. We have 3 short videos from 3 people from Australia who have so kindly talked about their experience. And this is a little bit different from services, and it's a lot about our rights and needs as people with disability. It's a little bit of, the 3 videos together are a little bit longer, so I'm going to move out of the way so that you can watch. But before we do that, I just want to introduce 2 of the people who will be speaking. So the last video that we'll have, not this first one, is by Jax Brown, who is an esteemed disability and LGBTQIA rights activist, writer, and educator. Jax is the co-chair of Inclusive Rainbow Voices, which is a new organization in Australia for LGBTQIA+ people with disabilities. Which is really not something we've seen before. And Jax utilizes their experiences as a queer, trans, disabled person to explore marginalized identities and work for intersectional justice and equity. We also have another video from Angela. Dr. Angela Williams is a survivor of family violence and lives with complex trauma, damage, and ADHD. She's a mother, author, recovering academic, and former sex worker, currently retraining as an upholsterer, which is very exciting. So I'm going to be moving out of the way. Hopefully the sound will work. I might have to plug something in. But otherwise, yeah, we'll just do the video.
Hello, and thank you for taking the time to listen to me. My name's Catherine. I'm a multiply disabled person living in Australia. I'm talking to you today about the use of technology and improvement in my experience of sexuality. So I have a hyperkinetic movement disorder, and part of for that is that I have an implanted deep brain stimulator. So I have a module in my chest and wires that go into my brain and sit in my basal ganglia and improve my movement symptoms. The ways in which this has improved my experience of sexuality is that my movements are less pronounced, so I can enjoy physical activity, including sex, more effectively, and I can enjoy the results of sex, like orgasm, without having it create a reaction called a dystonic storm, which is incapacitating. So I think that this technology has improved my enjoyment of my sex life, but it's also improved my mental health, because one of the side effects of the implant is that it acts on parts of the brain that improve my anxiety, depression, and OCD, which improves my mental health overall, which makes me more able to engage in a healthy sex life. So thanks for listening, and I hope that this has provided some insight into the ways technology can improve people's experience of sex and sexuality.
Hi, my name is Angela and I live with a couple of disabilities, some of which have seriously affected my sexual function. In some ways I could be classed as a bit of an expert on the topic of sexual function in the human body, having worked for a long time as a sex worker in some quite specialised roles, including offering services to people with a disability, whilst also living around my own. The thing I'd like to tell you about how technology has dramatically increased my sexual autonomy, and that of many I know, is the massive breakthroughs that we've seen in kind of assistive technology like vibrators and sex toys and the things that make you go bzzz. For myself, the combination of the medication and the symptoms of my illnesses mean that I often find it very difficult to notice sensations, feel sensations, focus on sensations, and because of some of the traumas that I've suffered, I'm not as into phallic representations when it comes to sex toys as I'm also just a little bit gay. That's okay. So for me, my world kind of changed when they started to invent these sex toys that are so focused and so intense and so designed to fit the human body differently. It has given me the ability to be able to achieve sexual satisfaction without having to mess around with things that mess with my head, including phallic representations. So the idea of making sex toys and sexual aids that are accessible to everybody, for me, there's this beautiful one. You just sit on it. It looks like a flower leaf. It's beautiful and astonishing, and it doesn't look like a sex toy at all. Having these kind of these advances in technology that allow me to engage with them for no other purpose besides my own sexual satisfaction, that has changed my life. It's so much easier to love the body I'm in when I've got these things that seem to be designed for whatever purpose I need them to work for. So never forget for a second that women with disability also like to have orgasms and be sexually active. That's part of this conversation too. Use those technologies. Go, ladies, women, do it. Yes.
Hi, my name's Jax Brown and I'm proudly queer, trans and disabled. I'm a white person with short dark hair and glasses and I'm seated in my black manual wheelchair. I'm wearing a shirt with the disability activist slogan, Peace on Pity, and I'm reading for a couple of notes today to keep me on track. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations on whose land I am and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respect to any First Nations people who are watching this. My talk today is going to look at how technology intersects with ableism and how this has impacted on my reproductive rights. Specifically, I'm going to discuss my experiences undergoing IVF treatments and the pressure my partner and I were under to screen for disabilities, both throughout the IVF, but also in the subsequent pregnancy. Now, I want to say up front that this discussion is in no way a judgment on people who in the past have decided to terminate pregnancies on the basis of disability. But I want us to critically reflect on the way that we're presented with information about disability by the medical profession and what this means in a socio-political context. I want to say very clearly that I'm a pro-choice feminist, and I strongly believe that people should have agency over their bodies and be able to make choices about their reproductive rights. And from a disability perspective, this includes people with disabilities' right to have children. To quote the American writer and author Anne Finger, sexuality is often the source of our deepest oppression. It's often the source of our deepest pain. It's easier for us to talk about and formulate strategies for challenging discrimination in employment, education, and housing than for us to talk about our exclusion from sexuality and reproduction. When my partner and I decided to try and have a baby through reciprocal IVF, my egg in her womb, we encountered ableism and a pressure to screen for disabilities throughout the process. When we went along to an information night put on by our fertility clinic, we were told by the nurse that they could test us and our future embryos, as well as the donor sperm that we were using for a variety of different disabilities. And when we said, actually, we are going to choose not to test, they were quite taken aback by that and implied that we were making a wrong or ill-informed decision. When we went along to our 10-week scan with our obstetrician, she said, I've noticed on your file that you've chosen not to do testing. I just want to let you know that it's not too late. We can still test for a variety of disabilities. And when I said, actually, we're choosing not to make that choice, we just want to have a baby, and whatever that baby, whoever that baby is, and however that baby's body or mind is, we're going to love that kid, and we're making that choice for us. She really didn't know how to respond and said, it's not too late to make a different choice. When we went along to the 12-week scan, the radiologist counted fingers and toes and was really quite happy to go, they're all there, it's all good. And we hadn't asked her to do that or give us that information. At the 20-week scan, they started taking measurements and then informed us that our baby didn't have the markers for Down syndrome and didn't look like they had spina bifida. And again, we weren't given the option to opt out of this. It was just information that they did as a matter of course. And it really caused us both to question the pervasive ideas around disability, and if we had had a fetus who had measured or looked like they had conditions, what additional pressures we would have come under to terminate that pregnancy. So I really want us to think about the power of the medical profession in how we think about and respond to disabilities. We even encountered pressure to screen right up until my partner was in labour, in the labour room. with the nurse saying that she noticed we hadn't screened for Down syndrome and really wanting to talk to us about that choice. And, you know, we were going to have the baby at that point. So it was just, again, this ongoing pressure to justify why we were making the choice that we were making. Living with a disability, look, it can be hard, it can be difficult, but I find a lot of pride and joy in having a body and mind that is outside the supposed norm. We need to think about the ways in which systemic ableism manifests and how systemic ableism makes my life hard, not being a wheelchair user. I don't want to change my body or brain. I want to change society, for it's society that disables me. In screening out disability, we're decreasing diversity. Now, I don't sit here with all the answers today to some of these big questions, but I want us to think about what are the implications of making these choices for human diversity, and what are the use of technology, how are they shaping how we think about disability and our reproductive rights. We need to critically reflect on how ableism can shape our use of this technology and what this can mean for how we think about and respond to disability. Thank you for listening.
All right, everyone. That was a wonderful video. I've watched it like 3 million times, and every time I still get, I guess, moved by what was said, but also feeling really inspired to be around people like the wonderful ones we've heard. So we're coming to the end of our session. We've heard a lot of things. We've spoken about a lot of things, and I want to open it up to the floor. If there are any questions for Q&A, if not, I'm more than happy to ask some questions or do a little bit of a wrap up. But are there any questions?
Thank you all. My question, I mean, it's clear from what Jax has just said and what we've heard, there's this constant kind of deficit modeling that if you are just like this, or there's a gap here that we need to address. I'm interested in the work that allies can do incidentally. For example, if I was going to go and have an STI check or a pap smear or whatever, are there questions that I can ask a service provider about accessibility options in that facility that might not have happened or that they might not have considered for people, so that it isn't an ableist environment? So those types of things, where those incidental moments where you can ask questions, so that people with disabilities are not carrying the entire labour of asking these questions of public hospitals or sexual and reproductive health clinics or whatever. So that's my question.
I think those environments largely in Australia are inaccessible to particularly wheelchair users. So people who have been to a women's health clinic or even to your GP's office in Australia know that they're often those, really narrow tables that aren't hard adjustable. So if you want to go and get your cervical screening done, that's really hard. And often is a deterrent to people because they can't figure out how to do it. And then we come across these real issues around preventative health and, catching, things like cancer and that early enough to be able to have positive outcomes from that. So I think, the breast screening buses, so for people who aren't from Australia, we have these large buses that kind of travel around the country, and you can, they show up in a local park or something, and you can go and get free breast screening done. But they're buses and they're not accessible. So if you're a wheelchair user or someone who can't navigate steps, it's not accessible to you, and there's not a lot of information on alternative options and where else you might go to access that preventative health. So that's a real issue. So I think, as people who might not experience barriers to those particular things, pointing it out and just asking questions, being like, hey, I noticed that your bed's not hard adjustable. Like, do you ever have disabled women come in and need to access that? I guess stopping short of shaming people in the moment, but just raising it. So that it might not be, you know, we hear with physical access all the time where we go, oh, hey, you know, how come you don't have a ramp into your building? And people go, well, disabled people never come here anyway. Well, let's go have a ramp. So helping people make that connection that maybe, you know, if the bed was height adjustable and people knew about that, they might actually, you know, we're 20% of the community.
Yeah.
Disabled women are what percentage of that 20?
I don't know.
Sorry.
But no, I think
lot.
there's also the question about in communities that are already marginalized, for example, Indigenous women, Black women, migrant women, a high proportion of those women are disabled, a very, very high proportion, over 50%. And so what's really important there as well is, like Kelly said, even raising if someone hasn't asked you something that you thought they might have. So something I bring up a lot is when someone asks me to go back and do something in the home or what my home situation is like, I always ask, have you considered a culturally safe way, or why didn't you ask me this? And really just drawing people's attention to it. It sort of feels like shaming, but you're just asking questions and people are embarrassed, and maybe they should be, because you know, saying disabled women don't come here is so like ridiculous. Yeah. And knowing that it's already so hard in healthcare and medical settings, just asking those questions. Is this desk height adjustable? Why are there no ramps? Or, you know, if for example, we're talking about the screening and the information that was given to Jax and their partner without them asking for it, you know, do you realize that maybe not everyone wants to hear that? Maybe next time you can ask me if I want to hear that first. Yeah,
Definitely.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Which kind of stage around the UNFPA guidelines? I've worked in the sexual reproductive health clinics for 8 years, like those. So I'm really interested. The guidelines, training and training in UNFPA countries, but is it also being rolled out into government facilities as well?
Yeah, it was public. The guidelines themselves were published in 2019, and since then UNFPA has been rolling them out in all of their regions. And so part of the implementation trainings we did were with government ministries from all of those different regions, and then UNFPA is tasked with them, working with them. So the example I gave from the Pacific is a specific implementation project working with each of those governments to take those pieces, particularly, for example, we're doing a pilot right now of where the Ministry of Health in Fiji already had a community health outreach program that was proving very effective to address unmet family planning needs. So part of implementing both the guidelines and the needs assessment research findings is that we've now piloted a community health worker program of staff by all people with disabilities who are partnering with those that already established system, but also addressing the unmet need of the community of people with disabilities. And so we're working with UNFPA to really take those different pieces of the guidelines, because it's broken down into preventative care, for example, mammogram machines that are inaccessible, to STI screenings, to maternal and newborn care. And so each region is supposed to kind of be familiar with the guidelines and work with the ministries to implement them, you know, broadly, but in practice, they're kind of picking, you know, pieces of it and then implementing it as funding and will is available.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Otherwise, I will wrap up.
So I have a question. I'm doing my master's project on autistic persons that face sexual violence. And I was wondering, since like rights regarding sexuality and reproductive rights around women with disabilities tend to be a topic that a lot of like medical professionals leave out, and it's very inaccessible. I was wondering if that impacts women, when they have faced sexual violence, they don't feel they have a space to talk about it. Either it's inaccessible or either they feel society doesn't necessarily take them seriously. I wanted to have your opinion regarding that.
Yeah, I might just start out also from an organizational point of view, from what we hear at Women with Disabilities Australia, and that is that it is very difficult already to make safe spaces for women who have experienced a variety of situations, let alone women who have access needs or have trouble speaking up about those access needs, or don't understand English and can't request a chair or a ramp or things like that. And so I think that that is definitely something that we've seen, but also because it comes back to the point where in services and especially through medical professionals, when the question is asked, when the topic is brought up, it's so much easier to have a conversation about those topics rather than when you have to bring it up on your own and you're not sure if how it's going to be perceived, or if the doctor, maybe you're a young woman with a guardian or a parent in the other room or in the room with you, and the doctor hasn't taken the initiative to ask to speak to you on your own, and you don't know if you can speak up because you're with a guardian or you're with a carer, or a situation that we talk a lot is that gender-based violence towards women is not just something perpetuated by domestic partners, but also perpetuated by carers and by guardians and by anyone who is looking after people, specifically in institutions. If you are in a care home and your nurse is looking after you and is perpetuating that violence under a lot of legal frameworks, it's not seen as, domestic violence, but it is. And so, I would definitely think that that's something that we hear is an experience, but furthermore, that the definitions of research specifically of that gender-based violence is often, does your partner inflict this on you, as opposed to a guardian, a carer, a parent, a sibling, a friend who looks after you primarily when you're out. When you rely on other people to support you in a world that is inaccessible, then you are way more subject to be able to get hurt by those people in more than one way: emotional, mental, physical, etc. That's sort of the organizational point of view. Kelly or Anastasia?
I think I'd just add to that, when you talk about institutional settings, particularly where people live, often those forms of violence won't even make it to police or the doctor. It'll be an incident report, if the person's believed to begin with, and then it's filed away and that's the end of it. So we've got a Royal Commission into abuse, violence, neglect and exploitation in Australia at the moment, and we've heard a lot of testimony where people have talked about the abuse or the violence perpetuated by people providing service to them, where it got no further than the immediate manager of the person, and they filed a report and that was it. That was the end of it. So and then we've got all other kinds of complex laws if it does make it to police, around whether somebody's considered a reliable witness and whether they could give testimony in their own court case. So often it doesn't make it to court, even if it makes it to the police. So there's lots of work that needs to be done in that area.
I second all of that. It's definitely, I used to do that work in group homes, specifically here in New York, and it's the exact same situation here and from our work in Women Enabled globally. If you aren't already familiar with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, they've done a lot of thinking in this area and do brilliant work. And the guidelines half of the guidelines is on gender-based violence services, and breaks down and includes a lot of good practices from around the world that seek to address the problems that were just highlighted, and some examples of how to work with stakeholders like justice actors, to work with the service providers and carers, to address family members, and really target some of that violence, which is similar to working with any sexual reproductive healthcare stakeholder. Really, of course, it's important to work at that high level government ministries, but a lot of the impact can really be made. And there's gender-based violence service providers who have a sexual violence, support groups that don't address people who have sensory needs and don't understand how to make a space accessible for an autistic person, let alone address a lot of the nuances that were just shared.
Thank you. We might wrap up quickly, and then we have a little bit more time in this room for obviously conversations among yourselves, or if you want to ask any, further one-on-one questions. But I want to thank you all for attending. It's really exciting to see people attending discussions like this, and I know and I hope that you'll bring it back to your communities and the work that I know some of you do, and I'm sure that even having conversations is really important and a starting point. I also want to thank Laurie from the bottom of my heart. She has done so much great work for us and work last night. So thank you, Laurie. And without people like her, these events wouldn't be as accessible as they could be. All right, thank you, everyone. We've wrapped up. Thank you to our panel speakers as well, especially Anastasia, who's so gracefully been able to be a part of this panel. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to go to Karina for 1 second. Thank you so much for having me. How's the rest of your week looking?
And also gender-based violence. So I just want to ask why I can do this work with organizations like mine, trying to solve the problem of gender-based violence, or sponsor projects related to gender-based violence. Doing work on that. Do you partner with organizations like us?
We do work on gender-based violence as it relates to women with disabilities. We tend to partner directly with women with disability organizations, and then as they see fit, they'll partner with other organizations that aren't led by people with disabilities to solve the problem and address it. But we tend to not work unless it's a big gender actor like UN Women or UNFPA. We don't really work as closely unless it's with a non-disability organization that's not led by people with disabilities. Because we want to make sure that we're providing our capacity for people with disabilities or addressing women's rights organizations.
We know you today, but I see.
Okay, so you work with organizations.
So like if you wanted to be connected to women with disability organizations in Canberra, then I can connect you to, and if you're not already in touch with them, I know they they, for example, went to some of the guidelines training that we did and worked with their ministries to address GBV access in Canberra. So connection with them. So if you're not in that situation.
Okay, so the organization should work with what I'm looking for. I can understand you, right? I can also solve. So I'm looking for other organizations that maybe I'm just
I think in terms of applying to some of those grants, if you're partnering, I will say there's been a shift in the last couple of years that funders definitely would expect to partner with an organization of people with disabilities. So having that partnership would probably help with that funding stream.
Right, so maybe
I don't have to out of practice on this stuff, but I'm happy to write down my email.
okay, all right, so let us see. All right, okay, so let me go ahead then.
That's right.
Or maybe the other cards you can share.
No, I forgot. Oh my God. Oh my God. Yeah.
All right.
Do I can review your piece too? Yeah, just maybe not the next week.
Like international efforts and trying to push like people who are negotiating like empowering disability with them, not as like separate events that are happening inside of us, but actually involved in the negotiation.
So
Living in
We're gonna come close. Sorry.
Okay, sorry, I'm back.
Oh, sorry, I need to finish this. Oh, yes.
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, I need to just.